Hi again, I'm Jack Lessenberry, and welcome back to Politics and Prejudices, the podcast. Today we're going to look at the auto industry, especially the American auto industry. We're going to talk today with one of my favorite experts on the industry, somebody I have most respect, but I want to start by making a few observations from my very much layman's point of view. You know, it's hard to remember now, but 11 years ago, there was a very real possibility that the domestic auto industry in this country might not survive. Both Chrysler and General Motors were in grave danger of falling into uncushioned bankruptcies that would have destroyed those companies, at least as we know them now. Had that happened, their demise would likely have taken many suppliers with them, and that could also have taken down Ford. Had the worst happened, we might have been looking at a rerun of the Great Depression, at least in Michigan. Of course, that wasn't the way it turned out. Though Congress showed little inclination to help the industry, first the outgoing president, George W. Bush, and then Barack Obama committed billions to bail out the auto industry. The result was, by nearly any measure, an enormous success. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler are now alive, well, and rolling in profits, though Chrysler was essentially forced to become a subsidiary of Fiat as part of the deal. But as we all know, this is not the auto industry of our youth, my youth anyway. Far fewer people work on assembly lines. Most vehicles sold in the United States are not made by what we used to call the Big Three. The vehicles we used to call cars, sedans, are almost an endangered species. The SUV is standard these days. 65% of vehicles made in the United States, sold in the United States rather, are made here. But many of those are made by transplants. And it's no longer easy to say what a foreign car is. Is it a Chevy made in Mexico? Is it an Acura made in Ohio with 76% American parts? When it comes to auto workers themselves, the world's also different, and getting more so. Back in the days of Walter Reuther and Doug Frazier, the United Auto Workers Union was known as the cleanest and most incorruptible one around. Now the UAW is mired in a terrific and far-reaching scandal that may result in some of the union's top leaders going to prison. This comes after years that have seen the UAW membership shrink by almost three-quarters, and the union's repeated failure to organize factories not owned by the Big Three, or I should say these days, the Detroit Three. Add to this the phenomenal growth of driverless and electric cars and the coming world of vehicles that drive themselves, and it's clear that the auto industry of 2049 may be as different from today's as ours is from 1979. But metropolitan Detroit is the place to put the world on wheels. Sometimes I eat lunch in a Coney Island started by a former Model T assembly line worker in a building that stands almost in the shadow of Henry Ford's now deserted old plant, a place that transformed the 20th century. This city grew up with and around the auto industry, and I don't see our rendezvous with each other and with destiny ending anytime soon. But having said that, I want to turn to someone who knows what's really going on. Kristin Dziczek is Vice President of Industry, Labor, and Economics for the nonprofit Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor. She has degrees in economic, public policy, and engineering, all from the University of Michigan. Is one of the most quoted and respected automotive policy analysts in America. Kristin, thanks for coming in today.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
So, what is your assessment? This is a totally unfair question, of course, but the general health of the domestic auto industry AD 2019.
It's pretty good. It's been an unprecedented expansion since 2009, the depths of a very sharp contraction in automotive sales. There was nowhere to go but up.
Right.
But these companies have turned back to being extremely profitable. They were able to shed liabilities off their balance sheet, as well as plants and other assets to the bankrupt shells of their former selves, to get to a point where we've had a decade of really very profitable operation.
Now, you're kind of a unique person in that you understand the industry from both the management and the labor point of view. You work for a nonprofit think tank that was founded by former head of General Motors, or his son, rather. His son. And, of course, you worked for the UAW at one time. What's your opinion of the current contracts that have now all been ratified? They look to me on the surface as if they're pretty good for the union.
They are pretty good for the union. I think the only thing the union might have sought and didn't really get back is they didn't get to change the letter about outsourcing, really, or closing
Right.
plants. So there is in all three agreements some version of you can't close plants during the term of an agreement.
Right.
GM proved that you could unallocate plants during the term of an agreement, and that protection, that job security protection of not closing plants, plant closing moratorium, stays exactly as it was.
What's the difference between unallocating and closing?
You know, in actuality, nothing, other than it took the agreement of the union to eventually close those plants. And that's always been the case, that, if a plant didn't have product, it could be on idle status, and sometimes they called it warm idle. We
Right.
might bring it back if we need to, but it always takes the agreement of the union to close a plant. Sometimes it has taken 1 or 2 contract cycles for a plant to eventually close, and there I'm thinking about a plant like Janesville in
Right.
Wisconsin. This was remarkably quick. GM made the announcements a year ago in November, and then the closures were made final in this year's negotiations.
Now,
So, that I think that they didn't get any flexibility in, the union didn't get any flexibility on bringing product back from Mexico or changing the North American footprint at all. They got a lot of investment in North America and in the US, but it didn't move the needle on what was already allocated to Mexico.
for those who haven't followed all of this, uh, last year, about a year ago, General Motors upset a lot of people by announcing they were closing a number of plants, including 2 Detroit area plants, the
Mhm.
one that was always referred to as Poletown, another one in Macomb County. What's the status of those plants now?
So they unallocated those 2 plants, the Detroit Hamtramck Assembly Plant, Warren Transmission, Baltimore Transmission, Lordstown Assembly, and the Oshawa, Ontario Assembly Plant as well. Um, those plants, Oshawa is going to close very soon. Baltimore and Warren and Lordstown are closed or closing. And Detroit Hamtramck lives to fight another day with $3 billion worth of investment in the plant and the product that will go in there. So that was brought back from the unallocated status with a new product.
Do you,
And
do,
$3 billion in terms of scale
right.
is huge. The new Toyota Mazda plant that was allocated to Alabama is $1.6 billion.
Wow.
So this is almost double what Toyota and Mazda is putting into a brand new, super huge assembly plant.
So will Detroit Hamtramck employ as many people as it always did?
It's unclear. So, electric powertrains and propulsion systems have fewer moving parts, and they don't necessarily require the same amount of labor. And that's one of the concerns the union had. At their convention earlier this year, they released a paper. You can get it on their website that talks about, their jobs that are at risk in the whole supply chain for internal combustion engines. You don't need piston rings and valves and all the engine blocks and things like that when you're moving to a motor and battery situation.
So, um, what about the big bone of contention with unions, of course, is at the worst times, they had to agree to sort of having a second-class citizen of automotive workers.
hmm So the second tier was agreed to in 2007, and it's a way to try to avoid 2009, the bankruptcy and the devastation that happened then. They were trying to head it off by letting new workers be hired in at a wage that was essentially half of what the legacy workers made.
Right.
They got a different set of benefits. They did not have the same health care plan. They didn't have the same post-employment benefits. They don't have a pension. A lot of things were different about that
They're sort of like
bargain.
permanent temp workers in a way.
Well, I mean, they weren't temp. They were
Right.
they were they had seniority and they could bump for new jobs and that, but they were a separate bargain for the wage
Right.
and benefits, both active and in retirement. So in this contract, all of those people who were hired after 2007 and before the signing of this contract at GM and Ford and at FCA, by the end of this 4 years, will be all making the same wage as the legacy workers, those hired before 2007.
Same wage and same benefits?
Not exactly the same benefits. So they'll have the same healthcare benefits. At GM and Ford, they've had the same healthcare benefits since 2015. Chrysler just caught up on that in this contract, assuming it ratifies this week, which it should. Then they will have the same healthcare, but they will not have access to a pension. They instead get money put aside for their retirement. They
Something
get
like a 401k?
something like a 401k, and then they get $1 per hour worked that's put away for them to buy health care in retirement, so they don't have access to the VIBA, which was the other transformative thing that happened in 2007, was taking that legacy load of paying for retiree health care off the books of the car companies and putting it in the hands of a union-managed fund.
Do we have an idea how the union has administered that fund? Does it look like it's in good shape?
It does look like it's in pretty good shape. So there's 3 funds, and there's public reporting on this, so you can pull it. and see how well they're doing. And it shows that the assets available to pay benefit obligations they're near 100%, 90 to 100% thereabouts. And they started off in the hole. I mean, they set this in place um, in 2005. There was a beginning of Aviva. 2007, they set it in place. It was supposed to start on January 1st, 2010. And there were some investment assumptions about what that money would do between 2007 and 2010 that obviously got wiped out by the
Wow.
2009 market. So they started in a bit of a hole, but they've come back up to, being fairly well funded for the obligations they have going forward.
Do you have any idea how many auto workers there are now in the United States?
Um, it varies.
Of course.
And, they were, um, yeah, I can't tell you right off the top of my head, but it's if auto and parts were around 900,000.
This is still a fairly major chunk of the American economy.
It is, and it's the other part about it is it's not just a job, like that there's this job and it's not associated with any other jobs.
Right.
And that's something, economists call an employment multiplier.
Right.
Many jobs, like a salary job, there's not a lot of a supply chain behind those jobs. So, your job,
Right.
because you're working, then people need to make headphones and microphones and audio studios and stuff like that. But that's a very small multiplier. But because somebody's working in an assembly plant, there is somebody who is making all of the parts and materials and the steel and the aluminum and
Sure.
the advertising and the engineering services and the accounting services and all of those things that go into this industry. And this industry has a big buy from the rest of the economy, and that means those jobs have huge multipliers. And we just did an analysis on General Motors jobs on the multiplier, and it's about 10.5. So every one job, an hourly job at General Motors, supports 10.5 other jobs in the U.S. economy.
So layoffs have a much more devastating effect than you might think.
They do. And, a salary job, like I said, doesn't have that same kind of supply chain behind it. The salary jobs maybe have one and a half other jobs associated with them, and it's largely because of them spending their paycheck in the economy, not because of a big fat supply chain behind their job.
It seems to me, and I don't know this for sure, but that the industry has been on a terrific roll for a long time. It's been since they came out of the recession, there really hasn't been any other real major dip in automotive sales in the United States. Is that sustainable?
Well, we're an industry that has a record year and then freaks out.
Right.
Like, oh no, the sky is falling. We just had a record year. So, 2016 was our peak for auto sales in the US. Last year was 17 million. Now we're at 17. I mean, 17 million sales is a darn good
It's a
year.
lot of cars and
It's a
trucks and
lot of
vehicles.
cars and trucks and CUVs. And, if this is the soft plateau, like I think anybody in the industry would take this. This is pretty good. But there is a concern, and there's a wide range of forecasts for 2020. Our forecast at the Center for Automotive Research is that it's going to come in around 16.5 million next year. So a little bit of a dip, but there's forecasters who are coming way, way down, and some who are a little more exuberant. So we really don't know.
In other words,
how
we
long
don't.
this is gonna-
It's like political polling. We don't really know.
you could get a wide range of answers depending on what people's assumptions are. And I was just at the end of November. The University of Michigan has the research seminar on quantitative economics and their outlook
Right.
for the U.S. and Michigan economy. And those both, their forecasts are looking fairly solid, and the auto industry looks to hold up well. I mean, there's a pattern that goes back over 60 years that as long as we have GDP growth around 3%, that the auto industry will grow. And we've had sort of lackluster GDP growth in the
Right.
2.5% range, and we've still had automotive sales growth. So as long as the overall economy is doing well, people have jobs, unemployment is low, people need cars.
And while I don't know cars, I know politics, and politicians like to those in power anyway like to make the economy keep going during an election year, which of course 2020 is going to be. So
It's really bad to crash in an
It,
election year.
it's bad for anybody in power when they crash an election year. So the shape of, you certainly worked for the union. The union, I'm wondering, do you think that the scandal the UAW is enduring now had any effect on negotiations?
I don't know. I mean, I think it certainly had an issue with and they're still involved in rebuilding the trust of the membership.
Right.
That they trust that their leaders are negotiating agreements that are in their best interest. And I think, the people who are in charge now have said that they're committed to, going out and making sure that they rebuild that trust and talk with members and get everything right with the world. Um, but they're also trying to get right with the world to avoid a government takeover.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they have a lot of incentive to clean up their act.
Yes.
And who is the head of the UAW? Tell us a little bit about the new head of the UAW.
I don't really know very much about him. Rory Gamble is the president. He's just been installed through the next convention. He comes out of Ford, was the leader of Region 1A, ran the Ford department, and then was selected to fill in temporarily when Gary Jones took a leave, and then is now in the permanent position at the helm of the union.
I started talking about the different. I said we're going to focus on the domestic auto industry, pardon me, as opposed to the non-domestic or foreign auto industry. But more and more, there's a real blurred line, isn't there?
Well, there is, and I think there's going to be more of a blurred line as we go forward. I mean, you also mentioned some of those big changes that are coming to the auto industry in terms of the move toward electrification, not just battery
Right.
electric cars, but more electrification overall.
Wasn't Mary Barra just saying that they're going to make electric trucks at the Detroit
Yeah,
Hamtramck
Detroit
plant?
Hamtramck's going to be making electric trucks. The old Lordstown plant was sold to a company called Lordstown Motors, which came out of a company called Workhorse that makes electric trucks. Of course, Tesla just demonstrated the Cybertruck
Right.
electric truck. There's going to be an electric F-150. Rivian, a company that's got an engineering office here in Michigan, is going to manufacture in Illinois. It's also going to make electric pickups. The move toward electrification is huge. The move toward automation of the driving task is huge. And, you can come back to Sergio Marchionne's Confession of a Capital Junkie that, there needs to be some consolidation or joint ventures or co-investment in many of these areas because
One company can't do it by
no
themselves.
one company can be on the front outlines of all of these things. And, an example is Cruise Automation. So General Motors buys this company called Cruise
Right.
Automation. And then Honda's like, hey, we like what they're doing. And so Honda invests in that. Now, is Cruise an American company? Because it's owned by General Motors, has investment from Honda. General Motors is one of the largest automakers in the world and is making a lot of money selling cars in China,
Right.
but they're headquartered here. So is General Motors an American company? This administration in Washington just in November, a date came and went that they were going to potentially impose additional tariffs on imported cars and parts.
Right.
They didn't release the study that they did to justify that under the basis of national security threat of these imported cars and parts. But they did have a proclamation, a presidential proclamation. And that proclamation said basically Ford and General Motors are the only American companies. And that their loss of market share has hampered their ability to do R&D, and that by protecting Ford and General Motors, they would build back the U.S. R&D base.
As an economist, what do you think of that proposition?
The U.S. R&D base is pretty huge and is contributed to by, Toyota has a big tech center in Ann Arbor. Honda's doing a lot of R&D here. A lot of the suppliers, Conti, Denso, Aishin, some of our top suppliers are foreign headquartered, but are doing R&D here. Michigan is the largest automotive R&D state, and it's not all Ford and General Motors.
Right. Over time, the percentage of vehicles in this country sold by the Detroit Three has gradually diminished. Is that still going to go on? Are the transplants going to have a larger and larger market share, or do we not know?
The market shares seem to be stabilizing pretty well. I mean, there's always GM is still the largest market share in the U.S. Toyota and Ford have been battling it out for 2 and 3. Toyota's in the second position right now. And they go neck and neck all year long and
Right.
battle that out. It depends. So there's about 24% of vehicles sold in the U.S. are made in the U.S. by international producers. And 25 or 26% of vehicles are made in the U.S. by U.S. producers. Then we get another 25% of vehicles from Canada and Mexico, and about half of those are made by GM, Ford, and FCA in Canada and Mexico for sale in the U.S. Our next largest trading partners are Japan, at about 10% of vehicles sold in the U.S. are imported from Japan. And then Germany, England, Italy, India, China, France,
Right.
make up all the rest of it.
So again, it's almost not a useful thing to talk about, domestic versus foreign cars.
And the way we count it 3 different ways. There's a domestic versus foreign fleet in our fuel economy regulations. There is a label that's on the car that you buy that says the American Automobile Labeling Act, but it counts U.S. and Canada content.
Right.
And then as part of NAFTA, which is going away, there was
Being replaced by the new NAFTA or
USMCA.
Yes.
There is a content regulation under that as well. So there's 3 different ways that we look at what counts as content.
We've certainly seen a lot of instability, maybe it's not instability, changes in ownership of auto companies combining. Do you think right now the Detroit Three are pretty stable where they are, self-standing GM, Ford, and then a Chrysler, which is still owned by Fiat? Is that likely to continue for the foreseeable future?
I think GM and Ford will. Chrysler, as you know, is in the midst of a potential merger with PSA,
Right.
Peugeot. Chrysler, under Sergio Marchionne, was looking to dance with
Right.
his words with other automakers because the scale of investment in this industry and the
Right.
scale of being a global player
Marchionne, which
is
you mentioned,
huge.
died a year and a half ago.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but his words live on in
Right.
many places. And just to be a full line automotive producer is a huge, huge, huge investment.
Right.
And even Fiat Chrysler as it stands now is really a truck and SUV producer. They're not making cars. They're importing a few, but they're not a full line producer anymore.
Now, last year at the auto show, I talked to a number of experts about the so-called autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, and they were really all over the lot. Some people said, well, this is actually coming. Others said the only thing you're going to really see is enhanced cruise control and maybe little sections of some downtown cities where you might actually have a self-driving car area. What's your take on all this?
Well, I think it's important to note that the vehicles that are available now are so SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, it
Right.
used to be called, but it's now just SAE. They set out the standards, the J3016 standard for what is automation. And it goes from automation level 0,
Right.
which is probably a car you had in 1979,
Right.
to automation level 5. Automation level 5 is the car itself can drive itself in all conditions, all roads, at all times with no human intervention. So that is this
Right.
platonic
Does
ideal.
that doesn't exist.
That does not exist. And where we are now is, Tesla and Cadillac and an Audi and a few others
Right.
are producing systems that are called level 2. Level 2 is a conditional automation. So, the GM system, the Super Cruise, is on certain highways. The car can drive itself with your hands off the wheel.
Can it turn?
It does not change lanes. It does not know what to do if there's construction on the road because the roads have been mapped.
Right.
So it goes with what it knows the road is. And if you look away for a second, you're going to be prompted to get back engaged in monitoring the driving task. So
It doesn't sound like much of a labor saving.
it's, I drove it this summer when I had to take my kid to camp and then go back up and get him at camp
Right.
again. And I actually put a lot of miles on that car. It's amazing how relaxing it is to but I mean, then you're kind of bored. You're just sitting there. You
Right.
have to be paying attention. You have to be
Right.
looking at the road. You can't be texting. You can't be tinkering with the sound system or whatever.
I'd actually think I'd be more apprehensive.
And well, I-75 up to near the bridge is where
Sure.
I was going, and there's hardly anybody on the road, and I'm
Right.
just, stay in
Yeah.
one lane and let the car drive itself. Um, I did not feel as fatigued when I arrived as I have
That's
on
good to
that
know.
drive in the past. But it wouldn't change lanes. It would,
Could you take over at any time and
and you
change them?
and you do
Right,
take over at any time,
right,
and you have to take over when it prompts you.
right.
And it prompts through, it flashes, it jiggles on the seat, it gets you back engaged in the driving task. Um, Level 3 is where the human has to take over and has to be in constant monitoring, and will allow. By the way, GM has the only system that the automakers themselves say this is level 2 and this is what we're certifying it
Right.
to. So GM is the only one that actually says you can take your hands off the wheel. Lots of people do this with other cars, and like the car needs a haptic response. It needs to feel that you've got your hands on the wheel.
They were
So
doing it when I was 17, although they shouldn't have been. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I heard people, tie a half-empty water bottle to the
right,
steering wheel so it gives it a haptic response so they can sit in the back seat
right.
or whatever. But and the Tesla system does change lanes and does other things. I haven't spent as much time in that car to give you a driver's experience of it. But level 3 is automation where the human has to be monitoring the system. Level 4 is automation, but with some restraint or some constraint on it. So it's like level 5, but it's only in Manhattan south of 45th Street.
Hmm.
It's only on roads wherein there's no precipitation. It's got some constraint on the system that it won't drive in all conditions on all roads all the time. And so that's Waymo is testing that, and a number of other automakers are out testing systems at level 4. Level 3 is a little more difficult because it does require that human to take over,
Right.
and that handoff is not always smooth and not
So we
not
are
easy.
years away, are we not, from anything resembling level 5, where you would really have a fully autonomous self-driving car?
I think most companies that are active in the space have issued some caution about level 5.
It's unlikely that I'll ever be able to get in my car and say, "Take me to Kristin's office in Ann Arbor," and go to sleep.
How long do you want to live?
Longer than that.
Well, I think,
Well, or longer than getting killed on the highway.
um, the systems are pretty good, and driving is very complex. And they're doing lots of on-road testing. They're doing lots of simulated miles, um, and really working to solve this problem. And quite frankly, the automakers have been working on solving this problem since the 1920s,
Right.
1930s. There were exhibitions at the World's Fair, uh, and GM had these videos, these old grainy videos you can find online of these roads have magnetic strips in them, and I mean, really,
From the 1939 World's Fair. That's
yeah.
right.
So they lock into the lateral control and the speed, and as long as you're staying in your lane and going at a certain speed, um, and maintaining the distance between other vehicles, then like that seems like a pretty easy task. But I think
Right.
most of the folks who got engaged in automated driving underestimated how complex driving can be and all of the things that you have to detect and pay attention to. The person in our office who's really expert on this pointed out, he said, do you want your automated vehicle to follow the rules of the road?
Right.
Okay. Do you want it to follow the
You would
rules of the
think
road?
so.
You would think so. But there's lots of times, and if you think about it, when you're driving home today, that you don't follow the rules of the road. And,
You've been spying on me. Nobody does anything.
well, lots of people don't. And so, what he gave me as an example is there was a right turn lane that opens up, and it
Right.
has a solid line for a period because of the bike lane that's
Right.
there. But because it was coming out of an industrial park, lots of people cross that solid line into the right
Sure.
lane to get over there. But if you're following the rules of the road, you would not cross into that right turn lane until you got to the dotted line where it is legal to then get into
Exactly.
that lane. Lots of us were going into the right lane over the solid line,
Or getting to the left turn lane before you're supposed to. 'Cause
or getting into the left turn lane before you're supposed to, or just doing
Sure.
unpredictable, weird human things. And I think that's the other part. So they call it a geofence, where there is a specific area that the vehicle has mapped out these roads really well. It's been practiced and is it's machine learning has learned these roads very well, and it's limited to driving in that area. Fine, if that's the only vehicle that's there, but it's going to interact with conventional vehicles driven by humans, then humans are a big disturbance factor into that system. If it was only automated vehicles on roads
They
that
would know how to
had,
behave themselves. That's right. But yeah,
and you can program it to do what it needs to do and follow the rules, but humans don't follow the rules. And humans are unpredictable. And I want to point out in the bigger economics of the situation, these new vehicles cost a lot of money. And the average vehicle on the road is something close to 12 years old. So just turning over the fleet
right.
till you have vehicles that have many of these systems, crash avoidance systems, lane keeping systems, adaptive
Well, the
cruise
history of
control,
tech,
all of the steps to automation is going to
sure.
take a long time.
But the history of technology is that things, when they're introduced, cost a whole lot of money, and as time goes on, the quality gets better and the price comes down.
Right.
So I would guess that might happen also with autonomous vehicles.
That might happen, but I mean, it also has to make economic sense to folks. And I think,
Right.
it makes some sense in fleet application where you can have that vehicle in operation 24/7. And that's why you see companies like Uber and Lyft that are ride-hailing companies who are investing in these technologies. They want to, get the driver out of the situation here.
Right.
But we've looked at this too, and only in super dense areas do you have high utilization of 70 or 80%. Otherwise, you're shuttling somebody from the airport out to Birmingham or something, and then you deadhead back to the airport, or
Right.
go without a rider. You're not making any money when you're deadheading, so you have to charge that rider more for
Right.
that ride because you've got to get back to where you can pick up
Another
passengers
ride.
again. And that's why in a very dense urban core, Washington, D.C., or Boston, or New York, or Beijing and Shanghai,
Sure.
and all these very dense urban areas of Paris and London, it could make sense because you're not riding empty very often.
Right.
There's also some big assumptions, I think, in some of those business models about these vehicles don't require repair. As they can go 500,000 miles. People want to share rides, and
I'm not so sure they do.
I'm not so sure they do either. And for a while, like in our office, once in a while we'd get a car, an evaluation car. But a few years ago, I wouldn't be able to do anything with that car other than go out to lunch because I needed a baby seat in the back. And a baby seat's a pain in the butt to take out of the
Right.
car and
Right.
reinstall in another car and then move it to something else. And people use their vehicles as, portable garages. You've got your hockey equipment in the back, you've
Oh, for
got all this
sure.
other stuff. So to go to a model where automated vehicles take you everywhere you need to go and we have less personal vehicle ownership, I think we're quite a ways away from that because people use their cars differently and don't mind that asset's sitting in their driveway because the convenience factor of being
It's an
able to
extension of
go.
their house.
Well, and you know, why don't people take the bus?
Right.
Because you've got to stand somewhere and wait, and you got to go to a schedule, and then when you're ready to leave, you got to wait. And there's some of that latency built into an automated vehicle that would pick you up and drive you around too. But like right now, if I'm like, okay, I want to go, I forgot something for this recipe, I've got to go to the grocery store, or I need to do. I'm not dependent on any schedule at all. That convenience factor of having my car in my driveway, and I can go where I want to go when I want to go there, is going to be something Americans are going to have a hard time giving up.
I think you're absolutely right. I want to talk a little bit about the whole concept of electric vehicles, electricity. The big, and I'm entranced by you saying that an F-150 electric truck is coming.
Hmm.
The whole problem is, better than I, has always been the length of battery life.
Hmm.
Is this being solved?
It's getting better. So you mean on the charge?
By the charge, how long
Yeah,
you go without a charge, which is
right.
why hybrids have come in and electric vehicles really haven't too much.
Well, and I think, in the next couple of years, you're going to see a real explosion of electric and electrified vehicles on the market.
What's the difference?
So pure battery electric it has no engine. It's not a hybrid. It
Right.
just has a battery and you plug it in and that's its fuel. Um, so then there's plug-in hybrids that have a engine and a battery and can work on either. There's hybrids that don't plug in. So those are generating electricity from the regenerative braking and from the motor that's running. And so it's,
It's
a
charging up
hybrid
its own
system. It's
battery,
charging
right?
up its own battery. Um, and, there's a wide range, and then there's 48-volt systems, which I can't explain very well. I'm sorry. But if you look out in the next couple of years, so I've got some friends in Ann Arbor, and, listeners know Ann Arbor, we're
Right.
known as crunchy, environmental tree hugging kind of people. And so I've got a couple friends who are looking into, putting solar on their roof, and then they want to get an electric car, and they want to be completely not dependent on the grid. And, they went out and looked at cars right now, and they're like, well, they're really expensive. And, there's like just a handful of things available. So
Right.
I said, in 2 years, there's going to be like an explosion of models available. So right now in the sedan segment, it's the Chevy Bolt, the Nissan Leaf, the Tesla Model 3. These are kind of making up the bulk of the systems. There's a lot of hybrids out there. There's a plug-in Pacifica from FCA.
What's the most miles they can get on a charge?
They're going out to about 300 now.
Okay.
I mean, so, and the battery costs are coming down rapidly. Um, so it's becoming more of an economically sensible thing to do. Um, and but the think about the pickup trucks. So some people have a pickup truck to tow big heavy stuff, snowmobiles and horses and
Right.
work trucks kind of things. They're going to carry heavy loads, and they're so the payload capacity matters to them and things like that. I don't know that an electric truck right out of the bat is going to work for them, but there's a ton of pickup trucks and vans that are out, fixing phone lines and installing cable at your
Right.
house. They're not towing heavy stuff. They're, the plumber, the people who have trucks for work trucks that don't need the heavy load capacity. Many of those are in fleets that are going to come back to the same place every night. So a charging situation where they're going to, charge back at home base overnight. And, we did a study for one of those providers about a decade or so ago, and I was really shocked to find out that, a service vehicle like that may only drive 60 or 100 miles a day as it goes from your house to somebody else's house to somebody else's house. They're not doing a ton of miles. So
But that kind of driving takes more wear and tear on the car, doesn't it, than getting on the freeway? And
it
just
does. And, battery's really good for this. And, for some of those systems where you might need a generator when you're on site, a battery electric pickup truck that can also serve as a generator for providing electricity out, when you're, um, you know, clearing phone lines or doing something that requires power on site. There could be, some real synergies there. But I think fleet pickup trucks for service vehicles make a ton of sense. Pickup trucks, electric pickup trucks that aren't carrying heavy payloads and towing. Um, Electric has incredible torque, and I mean we saw that with the Tesla Cybertruck tried to show how capable they were by towing a F-150 up a hill. Not exactly a fair comparison because the F-150 wasn't four-wheel drive and
right.
all that kind of thing. But and there was somebody at Ford who said, we'll take that challenge. Give us your truck and we'll show you what a real F-150 can do. So, I think, we're going to see electrification across not just the trucks, but vans and CUVs and more hybrids than we've been seeing. It's partly, there's a couple of things going on. One is the rest of the world has very aggressive standards for fuel economy moving forward, and the government of California and the states that align with California. And in order to meet those standards, these global automakers have to develop these technologies. And then, as part of the new trade deal that exists as signed yesterday, we see that there's an incentive to locate advanced battery production in North America. I think there's a lot of logistical reasons why they will do that as well.
So are you saying that kicking or screaming, even if it's kicking and screaming because of the world market, the Detroit Three are going to be dragged along and they're doing it?
They're going to have to do it to be part of the global market for vehicles. Yeah.
I've got one little snarky environmental question. You mentioned your friends who want to be off the grid, so they want to get an electric car. But doesn't that require plugging your electric car into something that will burn fossil fuels to
See, they
regenerate
were
the
getting
battery?
solar roofs, so
Solar, right. But still, electrification right now, it's usually the charge is if you plug it into something, it's conventional means that are being generating the recharge.
And yeah, and that the grid cleanliness or what the grid
Right.
is varies by region.
Exactly.
A lot of places it's nukes, and some places it's hydro, and the grid is
Right.
cleaner in different parts of the country than in others. Um, Nissan just put out a sustainability report. I had it on my Twitter feed this week, and retweeted it, and they showed a chart that showed a conventional internal combustion engine vehicle and where it incurs its carbon
Right.
versus a Leaf. Um, and so the Leaf may have a greater degree of carbon pull for the manufacturing process because they are importing many of their
This is
components.
Nissan's purely electric car.
Yeah, this is their battery electric car. Um, but the operational use, the carbon for operational use is much, much smaller than it is from a traditional gasoline electric. So there is a net reduction in carbon
Right.
over the life of the vehicle. But initially, the manufacturer incurs more carbon, and you're right, in certain regions of the country, it's a coal-fired car.
Right. Which is not exactly environmentally friendly. Um, Finally, we're talking about all these wonderful environmental things, but a big part of car culture, certainly in metropolitan Detroit, has always been muscle cars. Cars that burn a lot of gasoline and are built to do high performance things. Is that going away?
Well, there was just recently a publisher of a number of those enthusiast magazines pulled back, I think, 10 titles that they're not going to publish anymore, and they're moving more to an online realm. Um, you
Well,
know,
that's true of all publications in general.
well, and I think, and there's still enthusiasts
Right.
out there, and there's still a need for muscle cars, and let's talk about the Mach-E. The Ford um, took the Mustang name and put it on a CUV, an electric CUV. We're not far away from an electric Mustang too, and
But the
these.
jury's out on how well that will do. Remember, Ford took the Thunderbird name and put on an increasing succession of larger and clunky vehicles, and
Well, they did, but I mean, I think that an electric vehicle or electrified vehicle has incredible torque off the line. They're
define
fun to drive.
torque for those of us who didn't know that well in physics.
You can go fast quickly, so
Right.
you don't.
Wonderful.
How's that? So you don't have any, ramping up 0 to 60 times are
Right.
much faster. They're fun to drive, and they can be really sporty and enjoyable to drive. They don't have that same, throaty
Right.
noise that maybe a Charger or Challenger or
Right.
Corvette and those vehicles have had. But I think we're going to see a wide range of propulsion across all of the segments, including in the performance segments.
What else should people know or people be on the lookout for in the auto industry in the coming months and years?
Well, in the coming months, I mean, I still see incredible uncertainty around trade, despite the fact that the USMCA changes have just been signed. It looks like there's a green light from the
Right.
AFL-CIO and the Democrats in the House to move forward with implementing this new NAFTA for North America. And there's a lot of things that have to change in order for
Kind of
the.
ironic, the day they're voting on impeaching the president, they're sort of congratulating him and accepting the new NAFTA.
They changed it quite a bit.
Right.
And I think, there's some changes in the supply chain that will need to take place, but we still have an ongoing trade dispute with China.
Right.
We have a phase one deal with Japan that doesn't address autos yet, and that, is going to ramp back up in the spring to start talking about and, bringing autos into the trade deal with Japan. Europe, we have a set of tariffs so far that have only been around the Boeing Airbus dispute and cheese and wine and
Right.
German men's swimsuits. A number of weird things got tariffed
Right.
in the EU,
I didn't
US.
know about the swimsuits, but it's
Yeah,
good to know.
well, they're very much more expensive now. Um, uh, but I think that we're still in a period of uncertainty about where the tariff situation is going to go. And regardless of who wins the election next November, some of these trade disputes may continue. I think there's bipartisan support, at least for um, some some degree of uh, resolution to the China issue.
We should mention the trade disputes with China and Japan were around long before President Trump.
They were, and I think that there's bipartisan buy-in to that there's issues there, but there are different tactics that
Right.
a Democratic president may be more multilateral in their approach than this president has approached them very bilaterally. So I think there's still a lot of uncertainty around trade and tariffs for this industry going forward. But we've got new agreements with the union that look to be in place, and we can move forward from that. So there's not uncertainty around what the wages and benefits are going to be for the next 4 years. We know that the technology pathway is fairly risky and uncertain. And some of that can intersect with the trade issues too. So
it's going to continue to be a fascinating, complex, and hugely important industry.
yeah, and it's still going to be here in Michigan. I mean, a lot of the R&D, a lot of the the development and the brains of this industry, even in the automation sector. Everybody thinks it's Silicon Valley's running away with that, or Pittsburgh, but they all come back to here, and Detroit's a big player in that.
Well, we're still the automobile state.
We are.
But at least maybe the vehicle state. Maybe we should say it that way. Well, as always, when I talk to you, I found it utterly fascinating. Part of me wants to go on for hours, but you've got other commitments. But this is a topic that I think you can never really know enough about for Detroit, which really never grows old. So thank you so much for making this time today.
You're welcome.
You can also catch up with my writing and many essays and podcasts you may have missed in my blog, lessonberryinc.com. That's ink as in ink pen, not as in corporation. And if you do, please go to my website and subscribe. The price is right. It's absolutely free to subscribe to both my podcast and my writing. I want to thank my guest again for taking the time to come to our studio here at Startup Nation in Birmingham, and also thank everyone who donated to help fund the production costs of this podcast. If you too would like to help keep these podcasts going, I'd be thrilled if you'd send a contribution to me via PayPal on my blog, or via check, snail mail, if you still use snail mail, to the Zing Media Group, 186 North Main Street in Plymouth, Michigan, 48170, or message me on Facebook or via my blog for more details. And again, I hope to see you next time. Listen to more episodes, tell your friends, and feel free to get in contact with me. This is Jack Lessenberry with the Politics and Prejudices Podcast. I'll see you again soon.